The Bible is full of stories of women who marked generations with their faith and courage. Some faced personal challenges, while others took bold steps that changed the course of history. But what can we learn from these women? In this video, we'll meet 5 inspiring characters who placed their trust in God and had their lives transformed. Each of them faced barriers, challenges, and moments of uncertainty, but something in common guided them: unwavering faith in Almighty God. Their stories continue to impact millions of people to this day. Stay with us until the end to discover how these women can strengthen your faith and encourage you to trust in God, even when everything seems impossible. Now let's start with the story of Sarah, the woman who believed in God's promise. Sarah, the woman who believed in the impossible. Sarah, the wife of Abraham, is an example of faith and perseverance. For years, she carried the burden of infertility, a great pain for a woman in her time. However, God had promised Abraham that he would have a son, even though he was very old. In Genesis chapter 18, verses 10 to 14, we read that Sarah laughed when she heard she would have a child in her old age. "Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." From a human perspective, everything said it was impossible, but God showed that he fulfills his promises at the right time. And so, at the appointed time, Sarah conceived Isaac, the child of promise. This story teaches us that God is faithful, even when circumstances say otherwise. Sarah initially doubted and even tried to help God by suggesting that Abraham have a child with her servant, Hagar. This resulted in the birth of Ishmael. However, God reaffirmed his promise, and despite her initial doubt, Sarah saw the miracle happen. Sarah's faith was tested, but in the end, she saw God's faithfulness. In Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 to 3, we read, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. Sarah laughed in disbelief, but she also laughed with joy when she saw God's promise fulfilled." Her story reminds us that even when our faith wavers, God remains faithful and fulfills his promises. Have you ever faced moments when you doubted God's promises? Comment below how this story can strengthen your faith. Now let's move on to Ruth, a woman who teaches us about loyalty and absolute trust in God. Ruth, the woman of loyalty and faith. Ruth is a great example of loyalty and trust in God. After losing her husband, she made a choice that changed the course of her history. She decided to follow her mother-in-law Naomi back to Bethlehem, instead of returning to her homeland. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 16, she says, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." This decision demonstrated unwavering faith. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth found work gleaning in the fields of Boaz, a righteous and God-fearing man. Eventually, he married Ruth, and they had a son who became a direct ancestor of King David and consequently of Jesus Christ. Ruth's story shows that God honors our faithfulness and leads us to places we could never have imagined. Ruth not only found a new home, but also became part of the Messianic lineage. Her loyalty to Naomi and her trust in God led her to be blessed in ways she could never have imagined. In Ruth chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, we read about the birth of Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Ruth teaches us that even in the midst of loss and uncertainty, faithfulness to God and the people we love can lead us to unexpected blessings. Now let's talk about Esther, the queen who risked everything to save her people. Esther, courage to save a nation. Esther was a young Jewish woman who became queen of Persia and had to make one of the most difficult decisions of her life, to risk her life to save her people. When the wicked Haman plotted to exterminate the Jews, Esther was encouraged by Mordecai to intercede with the king. But appearing before the king without being summoned could lead to her death. In Esther chapter 4 verse 14, Mordecai said, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" With courage, Esther decided to risk her life. She fasted for 3 days and then went to the king, successfully saving her people from extermination. Esther teaches us that God can place us in strategic positions to fulfill a greater purpose. Her courage and faith were rewarded, and she became an instrument of salvation for the Jews. In Esther chapter 5 verses 1 to 3, we read about the moment Esther presented herself to the king. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given you." Esther revealed Haman's plot and pleaded for the life of her people. The king, enraged, ordered Haman's execution and issued a decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves. Esther's courage saved her people and established the celebration of Purim, a festival commemorating the liberation of the Jews. Her story teaches us about the importance of courage in the face of danger and trust in God for deliverance. Now let's move on to Mary Magdalene, a woman transformed by the love and power of Jesus. Mary Magdalene, transformed by the love of Jesus. Mary Magdalene had her life completely transformed by Jesus. Before meeting him, she was tormented by 7 demons. In Luke chapter 8 verse 2, we read that Jesus set her free. After this deliverance, Mary became a faithful follower of Christ. The most remarkable moment of her story occurred after Jesus' resurrection. In John chapter 20, verses 11 to 18, Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the risen Jesus and was given the mission to announce this event to the disciples. She teaches us that Jesus can transform any life and give a new purpose to those who follow him faithfully. In John chapter 20, verses 16 to 18, we read, "Jesus said to her, 'Mary.' She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, 'Rabboni,' which means teacher. Jesus said, 'Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God.' Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, 'I have seen the Lord,' and she told them that he had said these things to her." Mary Magdalene is an example of transformation and devotion. Her life was completely changed by her encounter with Jesus, and she became a faithful witness of his resurrection. Now let's move to the conclusion of our study and a final reflection. Today, we explored inspiring women from the Bible who faced challenges, trusted in God, and had their lives transformed. Sarah, Ruth, Esther, and Mary Magdalene show us that faith and courage can change destinies. If this video inspired you, leave your comment and share it so more people can learn about these stories. See you in the next video.